Hi, I'm Helen Hamilton-James, Managing Partner of the Western Sydney office for Deloitte. I'm really excited to be moderating this next session here in Immersion. Game-changing cities featuring the perfect lineup for this discussion. We have Roch, Cheroux, he's the CEO of Sydney Water, Geoff Roberts AM, Chief Commissioner of the Greater Sydney Commission and Chief Investment Officer of Investment New South Wales, and Duncan, General Manager of Business Development at Celestino. I'm really thrilled to be speaking to our panel today on the topic of the future of Western Sydney, a smart digital success story in the making. Each of our three panellists has a really unique perspective on the development of the Western Parkland city, which is an area including an entirely new city, Bradfield, which is being built around the Western Sydney International Airport, which is due to open in 2026. I'm really looking forward to discussing with them the opportunities and challenges associated with developing this 40-year vision developed by the Greater Sydney Commission. The Greater Sydney Commission's plan envisaged a sustainable, digitally enabled, modern, innovative area with some really creative, leading-edge businesses creating jobs in areas such as advanced manufacturing, medical research, agribusiness, health, education, aerospace, to name just a few. And all of it's being built essentially out of a greenfield site, so it's a big challenge. There's already substantial investment committed by both the state and the federal governments to ensure that the infrastructure is in place to ensure that this vision can be realised. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the region, and I think for Australia as well, and it will really help to drive Australia's economy into the future, taking advantage of the emerging technologies, advanced manufacturing, innovations, etc., and make it a place where people really want to work, live and play. And we'll talk about that as we go through the session. However, developing a new city from greenfields is not straightforward. It's challenging. There are some challenges around that. The population in the area is expected to double to well over 2 million people in the next 40 years. It's a significant area. There's over 9,000 square kilometres. We have some climatical issues. We have some areas that are prone to flooding, and we also have an area where the temperatures can be up to 10 centigrade higher than on the coast. So there are some challenges. But anyway, I want to start talking to our panel, who are the experts in this space. But Roch, I was wondering if we could start with you. I've touched on some of the challenges around developing the Western Parkland City and Greater Western Sydney, but I wonder what your perspective on those challenges were. Obviously, the CEO of Sydney Water, responsibility for ensuring that we have water for all those new houses and businesses. So I was wondering if you could share your perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Helen. Look, I think what's really important when you look at a new development area, but actually also when you look at an existing area that you try to redevelop, what's really important to look at is the role that water can play in the area. And you've mentioned challenges, population, climate change, heat island effect, etc., etc. And the fact that we want to create a place where people can really enjoy themselves and be really happy where they live and learn and play and work. And that's where water has a big role to play. So when we look at Western Sydney, it's actually looking at doing water differently in Western Sydney as we do in other parts of Sydney, but not the traditional way. And that's about really integrating the water cycle management. And what I mean by this is not only thinking about water as just a pipe for drinking water and a pipe for wastewater so that you can just open the tap and flush the toilet without thinking about it, but that's actually integrating also recycled water and integrating also storm water and the waterways. And taking all these different forms of water, then create an environment that is really designed around water, and that's what gives you the possibility to have a tree canopy. That's what gives you possibility to have parks and gardens and green buildings and green facades, and really creating an environment that is really different. So water is there. It's about using it in a different way. And I should say also that technology has a big part to play here, because when you want to integrate the water cycle, you also need technology and IoT and etc. So there is a really a big opportunity, actually, rather than challenges, a big opportunity to do things differently. And on what Geoff and the Greater Sydney Commission have built, on the vision that they've built, and on the projects that we're working on with Celestino, they are really a fantastic opportunity to create this different space for the people that are going to live in Western Sydney.
Fantastic, thank you. Geoff, as the sort of architect of the metropolis of 3 cities, the master plan and the vision, obviously you've been instrumental in that. What's your perspective on what we need to do now? Where are we? We've obviously created a vision, but I'm really interested in your perspective around next steps and what you think needs to happen now.
Look, it's the fundamental question, isn't it? I might answer that just by going back to why we have a metropolis of 3 cities, because if we understand the root cause of why Western Sydney is where it is and what it could be in the future, I think that'll help this discussion. So the problem with Sydney at the moment is we have a front door and a back door. We have the first city where we've been prioritising spending of infrastructure for over 150 years, and we've had traditionally in Western Sydney suburban unconnected developments. Now the problem with that as Sydney grows from 5 million to 8 million people is we just run out of space to really think about smart, digital, green connected cities if we keep that model going. The other thing that happened was the federal government decided to build a new airport in the middle of the last decade. Now we only do that once every 100 years or so in Australian cities. So our mantra at the Commission was not to build an airport, but to build an airport city, and to really, the vision is really about building an economy in Western Sydney. Not more houses only, but an economy. Jobs and housing and placemaking all to happen at the same time. What we don't want is to subject Sydney-siders to longer commutes between where they live and where they work. We talk about the 30-minute city. So that's the logic of the metropolis of 3 cities. Now, in the 5 or so short years since that whole concept was developed, we've really achieved quite a lot. Federal government and state government have spent or have agreed to spend about $30 billion. That is the highest expenditure anywhere in the country of aligned expenditure between the federal government, the state government and local government. So I'm confident that we've got the beginnings of our rail line, the beginnings of our airport, our hospitals, the West Invest Fund. I'm quite confident that all that's happening. But now it's time to really focus on jobs and to really make sure that the private sector are brought along. And Celestino, let's be honest, were the early adopters of Western Sydney, in fact, well before the Greater Sydney Commission. And they are an example of the type of developer that we need. Well, they're not really developers, they're really place curators. And what we need to do is create 200,000 jobs between us all. That's 3 Macquarie Parks in half the time of Macquarie Park. So that's 6 Macquarie Parks we need to create in Western Sydney in the next 20 years. We can't do that as a government-only exercise. And now the challenge is to liberate the private sector to help achieve the jobs aspirations of the government.
That's great. I absolutely agree. I think that's a great point. I think government's done a phenomenal job. I think it's now, private sector, we need to step up. So Duncan, as you know, as part of the organisation that's really driven a lot of the thinking around the science park in Western Sydney. Maybe you could talk about, you know, your experiences around that, what you think needs to happen next, and maybe some of the opportunities that Celestino and you see, you know, around the opportunities in the region.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I think obviously Roch and Geoff have talked about there's lots of opportunities and challenges, and particularly when you're establishing innovation ecosystems, in particular from greenfield, there are a lot of challenges, and it's very complex when you want to get that started. You need human capital, you need financial capital, you need to have innovation infrastructure, you can have the right enabling policies and regulations as well, and you need certainty. So when you look at the Aerotropolis 2, this is going to be a long game for everyone, and we need to make sure that it's well coordinated and it's also well orchestrated. So the New South Wales government and the federal government have created that platform. There are a few things, I think, in terms of from a property development perspective where we think there's opportunities to take it from a vision to a reality. And I think the first one will be certainty for the private sector. We need to make sure that we've got enabling regulations and policies that enable us to get on and do what we do best, which is to innovate and to deliver. We need to make sure that there's still flexibilities within that framework that's created by both state and federal government. We don't need more layers of bureaucracy, we don't need more red tape, we just need to be able to make it easy for us to do what we need to do, and that's the focus on that certainty. And the work that the Western Parkland City Authority and the Department of Planning are doing, we're getting there shortly, which is great. So certainty is the first one. I think the second one that we'll really need to have a real focus on is making sure that regulations and codes keep up with the pace of digital and innovation change, because what will happen is we'll have all great technologies like the ones that NEC are producing, but the regulations and the standards aren't keeping up pace with it. So we won't be able to implement it, we won't be able to use it because the regulations are still a bit behind us. And there's great productivity gains that we can gain right now by using high technologies to validate and certify processes in the construction sector or in property development. Too often there's machines that are sitting idle, there's people sitting idle while someone has to go in, take a physical sample, take it back to a lab and so on. So I think the second part we need to make sure is that regulations and standards keep up with the pace of technological change. And I think the third important bit that the private sector will be looking for is enduring champions. And when I say enduring champions, I mean champions that are leaders in industry and leaders in government that will make it their mission to make sure that each and every precinct in the Aerotropolis is successful, and that the language is more about and rather than or. It should be Bradfield City Centre and Sydney Science Park and Memory Precinct and the Agri Precinct and the work that Louise Waterhouse is doing, or BHL Holdings and so on. I think there needs to be the change in language around it's an and, not an or. And I think the time is right now for government as well to look to cast the net broader and maybe look at precinct by precinct opportunities like they've done at the Bradfield City Centre. They've done an impressive job catalysing and seeding that precinct. The $1 billion in infrastructure for that area, the 50 million, I think, for the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, and then the CSIRO's headquarters that are also going there. I think we need to start to work with government and with the private sector to put seeds into the other precincts where, you know, government could catalyse it through some public investment that the private sector matches and exceeds. And I think through that mechanism, we can look at the broader opportunity where we get the platform right for the private sector, give us the certainty, give us the way to do it, and let us innovate and deliver. Because there's never been a better time right now. There's not a more needed time than right now. So I think we're getting everything right, but the time is to act now. We've been talking about the vision for a long time. Just give us, you know, the certainty, give us the platform, and we'll do what we need to do.
That's great, Duncan. Thank you. I think underpinning all that you just said, there was the need for collaboration, and obviously that way of working and thinking across, you know, private sector, private to private, state, local, federal, utilities to utilities. So I was interested, Roch, in your view on collaboration and how we achieve that, and maybe some of your experiences at Sydney Water around things that you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical, and Duncan has made a very important point when he was talking about because when you're building infrastructure, you need to think about what's coming next, because infrastructure most of the time will come first, and then the development will happen, etc. So that's where collaboration is absolutely critical, because if we understand what the people that will be living in Western Sydney in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time want to have, then we can plan and construct in a prudent and efficient way, and not only in terms of what will be delivered in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of cost, because it has, the good planning has a big impact on the cost and the long-term cost. So collaboration is absolutely critical, and I think it's really critical that it's not only collaboration between utilities, it's also collaboration with government agencies, it's also collaboration with developers, it's also collaboration with the different industries that will be having a big part to play in Western Sydney. And I think this collaboration is even more critical at an early stage, because this is now that we're building the future. And I want to mention something that I've actually never seen before in my career in different countries, and that's the collaboration that we've got with the electricity and gas industry. So we have a partnership with Endeavour and Gemini, and we are working together to really build innovative solution, multi-utility, where really instead of talking on one side to water, on the other side to electricity and then to gas, you can really have one group of utilities that will be working together, cooperating on where to locate the pipes, where to locate corridors, and deliver solutions for customers that are a lot more efficient. So there is a lot of things where collaboration is really critical. I was talking about these three utilities. You plug to that the role of technology, and then you start thinking, okay, if we've got a corridor with water, gas, and electricity, well, it's obvious we need to have data as well, and we need to have communication. And that's where then you start thinking, okay, so if I've got all this, then yes, it's obvious that I will have IoT devices everywhere, so that we can monitor the network, which is underground and therefore not visible and difficult to operate. So, and that's why, the planning phase, and this is now, it's actually started quite some time ago, but the cooperation and collaboration is absolutely critical to really deliver something of value to the future customers.
And it's great to hear that that's happening, and I think we've talked a lot about the need for advanced technologies, innovation, but ultimately it's people working together to create the solutions using the technology. So it's great to hear that thinking is coming to life. Geoff, if I can ask you a question around the vision. You talked about making it about jobs and placemaking, and we talked about digitally enabled city. But what is it that's going to make people really want to live in Western Sydney?
It's just going to be better. It has to be better. I think we have, many of us, an unintended bias in Sydney that Western Sydney is out there and it'll sort of catch up one day. As the Chief Commissioner, I see Western Sydney quite differently. I think Western Sydney can leapfrog Sydney and in fact be a globally significant set of precincts and city region. A little bit like some of your listeners would know this, some of the Japanese examples in Greater Tokyo are good examples, but also the area we think about a lot is the Randstad in the Netherlands, where we have an airport centred with 3 or 4 cities, Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht and The Hague around that is very similar to Western Sydney. So I think we have to be careful in this fourth generation of industrial revolution in cities, and maybe even the 5th generation, that we don't constrain Western Sydney with preconceived growth areas. I could imagine a new town of Sydney in the middle of the century where the main commerce of Sydney actually happens in Western Sydney, not in Eastern Sydney. It's quite common, and my good friend to the right of me here, there's a city called Paris, which most of us know. The old town of Paris is not where you do commerce. It's where you drink your coffee and you have the beautiful food and the visitor economy happens. But the real commerce of Paris happens around Charles de Gaulle Airport. And we see it in Toronto with the Mars precinct, we see it in London. I can see a future in Sydney where Western Sydney is actually the exemplar for the nation. And this is what I think collaboration isn't strong enough moving forward. I think we need to move into a co-design world where we're actually solving problems, certainly in terms of, and Duncan mentioned this, certainly in terms of human capital and financial capital. We're going to need an equivalent amount of money at least from the private sector if we're going to get this thing up and running, genuinely up and running. We are well out of the vision stage now. We're building our first building next year. Duncan makes a good point about each of the precincts needing to play a role, but we, in government, we're going to need significant capital from the private sector, significant human capital for the private sector, and our job is to really get the environment for long-term, safe, knowable business conditions in place to enable that to happen.
That's great. Duncan, as someone that's sort of been involved and has invested earlier, I'd be interested in your perspectives on that and what do we collectively need to do to attract more businesses in? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but I'm thinking that global businesses, we've talked about Paris and obviously that, you know, Singapore's not far away. We're building the city of the future. And I think that global brand is hugely important. Do you feel we've got that at this point? What could we and should we be doing better around that? And I might open that up to the others as well.
Yeah, I mean, Geoff raises all the right points around his examples in Paris. I think for us, and Geoff also around how he's recognising how great Western Sydney is, because let's not forget how great it is, how vibrant it is, how diverse it is. It is a powerhouse of Australia. And I think people do forget that. For our perspective, it's really about being integrated and immersing ourselves with the community from the beginning. And it's really understanding what does the community want from us. Because to Geoff's point, we have these great ideas. We're going to create these beautiful smart cities out in Western Sydney, but we've got to make sure that the people that are living there buy into that vision as well. And I think they do. So I think from our perspective, how are we going to make the Sydney Science Park successful and it'll be safe with Bradfield City Centre and others? We have to focus on amenity, amenity, and amenity. Because we want people to come to the science park despite the science. And if we don't get the amenity component right, if we don't give it a heart and soul, we don't give it a vibrancy, we don't focus on the arts and culture, we don't create a place that offers diversity in accommodation, diversity in work types and activities, and also our diversity in lifestyles, because things are changing so quickly, then we're not going to have successful precincts. We're going to have all the great high-tech equipment and all the smart people, but it'll be soulless. And there's places like that around the world which we don't want. So the Paris example is beautiful because it's vibrant. It has its own soul. It has its own beat. It has its own life. And the rest will come. So I think if you get the amenity right, then the rest will be easier to do. I think a risk for us in some ways is that we don't keep up with the pace of how technology is changing. And COVID's amplified that. And even the CEO of Microsoft said in the first month of COVID, it accelerated technical adoption by 12 months. So people's perceptions and people's wants are changing now more dramatically than they have before. So we're also going to make sure that we have that flexibility on what we design and what we roll out, because things are changing so quickly. So that's one of the risks, is that we don't actually keep pace with technology, because it's exponential. But yeah, our main focus is creating beautiful spaces, beautiful amenities, restaurants, bars, cafes, shops, but then also have all the high-tech facilities for those businesses to come in, so we can create the jobs. And that's what we want to do at the Science Park, is to create those jobs that we need. The target, I think, was 200,000, Geoff, and we have to get on with it right now.
I think it's a really critical point. The opportunity to do in Western Sydney something completely different compared to... Yeah, Paris is a nice city. You've got some nice areas around Paris, but you've got also areas that were built in the 70s, that are only about business. and nothing about life. And you've got very few trees, you've got no green space, you've got very few people living in this area. So I think, mixing not only the business part, but with the people part, which includes dwellings, which includes parks, which include gardens, places where people can exercise, etc., can really have a life, and not creating a place where people will go to work and come back to or go back to another place in Sydney to where they live, but really integrating this environment into a place where you've got business, you've got life, you've got nature, you've got transport, you've got basically everything. And I think that's really the massive opportunity of Western Sydney to create something that doesn't exist anywhere else, because you would have created something from scratch where you've got all the components that you need to have to live a happy life.
And isn't that exciting? I mean,
it's wonderful.
Yeah, talked about the water aspects and
it's
the
wonderful.
mountains and
Yeah. Can I just talk about education? Because none of this will happen without education. Of the top 100 secondary schools in Sydney, 99 of them are based in Eastern Sydney at the moment. Now, that's not funny. We've got 6 universities in Sydney at the moment. 5 of them have their main campuses east of Parramatta. That's not funny. This is why Bradfield is so significant as the nucleus of this whole exercise, so that people like Duncan and others can grow out of this. The New Alliance and the 5 universities that are now coming into Bradfield, the CSIRO HQ for New South Wales will be in Bradfield. That we've got 28 businesses that we're currently speaking to come into Bradfield. This isn't the panacea. It can only ever achieve maybe 10 to 20% of our 200,000 jobs. But without that nucleus, you don't get the rest. And that's the role of the government, is really to make that happen. So education, without a new education training model that focuses on technical training, not just university training, it's not going to happen. If we want to be the advanced manufacturing superpower of the Indo-Pacific region, these are the market failure areas that the government has to focus on. We're well down the path of achieving that. Now it's time to co-design with our colleagues.
One thing I also add, Helen, which is important when we're building these new cities, and also to Geoff's point, we've got to make sure that we have equitability of access to education and also to healthcare. And that is also needs to be a priority when we start to build up these new cities, is that sometimes it can be a bit daunting for some people to come into a smart innovation zone. So we've got to make sure that we also address that equitability, and in particular in education, because of the disparity that Geoff talked about. And Sydney Science Park also sees that as a major opportunity where we integrate industry with school kids from a young age, so that they can be inspired to be something better than possibly their moms or their grandparents were, and so on. So that's also a big focus for us.
And I think the region is obviously home to a lot of migrants, first generation Australians. I think there's great, positive aspects to that. We're also home to the largest Indigenous urban population, I think in the country. So again, it's how do we make sure that everyone benefits from what we're talking about? And I think, it's great to talk about advanced technologies, manufacturing, but we mustn't forget about, a lot of the other people that live in the region, that we don't want them to still get on trains and have to go into the city every day. So
we don't, but we don't want Western Sydney to be the provider of the cleaners and the car mechanics for Eastern Sydney.
Agreed.
So we have to have the full complement. Can I just talk about First Nations people for a minute? The largest private landowner in Western Sydney is the Darubbin Aboriginal Land Council. They own more land than any other single landowner. It's about time that we started responding to and showing how the First Nations culture, the Waitemata people, the North-South Creek systems, it's about time that we showed that every day in the design of our city. And I know I've spoken to to Celestino and most of the large landowners and to Sydney Water about doing this. So let's get on with it.
Really important.
Yeah, doing it in a respectful way. The South Creek is a major piece of green infrastructure, if I can call it this way, and we need to respect it. But Sydney, Western Sydney is another opportunity to do something different in terms of our dealings with Aboriginal people. And because they are the traditional custodians, they are the traditional owner. And I can talk about one of the large projects that we have in Western Sydney, which is an advanced water recycling centre in Upper South Creek, where we have actually engaged with the local Aboriginal people in terms of development of the sites and development of the infrastructure that we are building. So it's not, it's not only putting a nice Aboriginal painting on the wall, it's really integrating the local people into the development of what we're doing. And that makes a very, very big difference in the way we do things. But that also bring a lot of traditional knowledge into what we're doing, which is absolutely fantastic.
That's great. We've talked a little bit about some of the challenges around the heat island effect, and we talked about the need for water and some innovative ways that we're looking at recycling and the circular economy within Western Sydney. So I wouldn't mind sort of your perspectives on what else needs to happen around that, because I think we've all been there. We've been walking down the street in Parramatta and it's roasting. So how do we make sure that we really mitigate that? And I know we've got green canopies, etc. But maybe Geoff, if I could, from the vision perspective, maybe first, and then more from a practical perspective.
I think this is one of the areas we most need help from the private sector, to be honest. I think green canopy is ground zero of what we have to do. We're going to need per capita, I think, Roch, about double the amount of water in Western Sydney per population as what we do in the eastern city, simply to support canopy and the sort of what Duncan talked about, the sort of urban amenity. But we're going to need much more than that. We're going to need apps for asthma and for lifestyle-based diseases. And, I think about companies like NEC and companies like Celestino. I think this is an area. I think the vision for the state government on net zero, I think, is quite impressive in the last couple of weeks as an example of that. But I think this is where we really need the smarts from the private sector to help us catapult to do kind of 5 years' work in 1 month or 20 years' work in 2 years. I think that's where we're going to need help.
If I talk about the circular economy, and obviously we've got the water with the work that we're doing with Sydney Water, which is also extremely innovative. That's also going to set us apart, and it'll be a great pilot and then an opportunity to scale that across the other developments. But the circular economy one is very important. We are lagging behind the rest of the world by miles. You can look at the European Union, you can look at London, you can look at Paris, you can look at the Netherlands. They are really mandating targets in terms of the circular economy adoption. When you look at us locally from a property development perspective, a while back the United Nations and also I think it was the World Resources Institute, they determined that about 40% of all waste by volume is from the construction sector. And roughly, the numbers might have changed now, about 30% of all emissions are from the construction sector. And what this needs is a change in mindset. We're building buildings just to build them, and we don't think about the cradle to grave. We need to start looking at new business models that when we design buildings, we're designing it that it's going to be reused at the end of its life. Not we just build it and then we're going to tear it down and put it into a waste tip. What we'll also need is the tenants of the office buildings to also say to us, we want circular economy value proposition in the buildings that we are going to be renting. Because if I don't like this carpet anymore, I'm going to trade it with my neighbour down the road and he's going to give me his wooden carpets and things like that. So I think there's amazing opportunities that we can start to rechange the dial on all those important issues about waste and reuse. But we also need, again, back to regulations and standards. We need support, obviously, from the government to give us the mandates for industries to start to change their mindset. There's also financial benefit from circular economy, so it doesn't need to be the stick, but there's also lots of savings that we can do. So we're super excited about that circular economy opportunity, and that's one that we're going to be focusing on very, very hard, because in a greenfield site, let's design these buildings to be reused. And that's what we're trying to look at. We're trying to look at smart ways of using concrete, because concrete has most of the emissions in as well. So these are all the kind of things that we have to start to look at. One thing we also have to be mindful of, though, when we start to adopt new technologies is there are existing technologies today that need to be phased out. So if you bought a car today that was an electric vehicle, you might have it for 10 or 15 years. So would we be able to sell a house to someone by saying, sorry, you can't actually drive to your house because it's not electric or it's not autonomous. You've got to drive 5Ks and then get the autonomous bus to your car. It may not be that easy to sell that house. We're not saying we don't want to aim big and aim high, but I think there's also part of working with companies like NEC and others is how do we get that transition happening in a smart way so that in 10, 15 years' time, we've migrated the laggards, but we're always going to start with bold ambitions and work with the private sector, the technology companies to help us deliver on our circular economy, sustainability and environmental commitments. We have to do more and we have to start it and be an example, like Geoff said, for the Indo-Pacific region of smart, sustainable construction. And it's happening here at the heart of in Western Sydney. And let's be a global lighthouse for all things advanced manufacturing, health, education and sustainable construction.
Fantastic.
I think Geoff said that it's an opportunity to leapfrog, and that's exactly what it is. So if you think about the possibility to design a place that is completely different, that's Western Sydney. You were talking about heat. We've demonstrated that if we create a place where we reuse stormwater, and instead of having stormwater running off the streets and into canals and into rivers, we can actually keep the stormwater in place and use it underground to water trees. And the same with recycled water. So there's a lot actually that can be done to cool down the city, but actually to create this environment where circular economy exists, because creation is one thing, but we want it to be sustainable and we want it to last. So I was talking about the Upper South Creek Advanced Water Recycling Centre. This is not only a recycling centre for water, this is also a place where actually we are completely exploiting the nexus between water and energy, but also the nexus between water and waste. Because actually, when you start thinking a bit broader, then there's a lot more that you can do in terms of circular economy and making sure that we're creating a place that is sustainable. And that's what's happening exactly at the moment.
It's fantastic. It's really great. We've got time for one wrap-up question. So I thought I'd ask each of you in turn. Obviously, we've got a significant audience which is not just Sydney-based, and we've talked about a lot of things. It's really exciting. It's the vision is phenomenal. But from each of your perspectives, what are the one thing that you'd want someone to go away with, on a business perspective, from anywhere in the country, anywhere in the globe, that would make them think, I really want to be part of this journey? So maybe Roch, we'll start with you.
Well, I would take, the challenge of the future for any business is people, attracting the right people. And to attract the right people, you need to create a place where people will be willing to live, learn and work and play and spend their life. And that's the opportunity for Western Sydney, creating this place so that we attract the talents and businesses will be interested to come and settle in Western Sydney.
Fantastic.
What I would say to our international audience is that whilst we have a relatively small national population, Western Sydney pumps way above its weight. It is much more significant than a derivative of its national population in terms of international business. It's safe, it's cyber secure, safe. It's got more money being spent on it at the moment than most other cities and precincts in the world, certainly compared to a number of Indo and Asia Pacific precincts. The Japanese community have been with us right from word go. I can't thank the Japanese community enough. There's never been a closer relationship between Australia and Japan than what we see at the moment. We're open for business. We're not just open for business in terms of government land, but all of our major landowners and precinct developers around us. Let's bring it on. I think one of your next speakers is Amy Brown, the CEO of Investment New South Wales. Her job is to leverage that inbound and overseas investment. So bring it on. We're open for business.
From our perspective, obviously we're a private sector business and we couldn't be more excited and more confident about Western Sydney around that aerotropolis. So confident, in fact, that we're already investing tens of millions of dollars in infrastructure when we don't even have a building built yet with the Sydney water recycling plant and things like that. So my feedback would be, or my encouragement would be, there's confidence from the private sector, there's investment happening here, but we need smart technological companies like NEC and other Japanese companies to come help us on that journey. But the time is now, the private sector is buoyed, and this is an opportunity too good to miss.
It's fantastic. I'd really like to thank each of you for your time and your amazing insights. So Roch, Geoff and Duncan, thank you, and you know, good luck. It's great vision, and I know stuff's happening, and it will be an amazing place to live, work and play.